It's really my pleasure to have Simon here, all the way from Australia, and his colleague Francesco. So Simon, I think we first met in 2019 in Berkeley at an event that was about gene editing, if I'm remembering.
I think you met Sonia in 2000.
Maybe, okay.
And we met
after that
in London at the Royal Society event.
All right, well, certainly we saw each other then, but Simon is an associate professor and he's the co-founder and I think the director.
I've had a promotion about 7 years ago.
Then you need to update your website. You need to update your websites. So he's a professor and a co-founder and the director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance in Canberra, Australia. He got his PhD from the Australian National University. And when you look at his work, he really has done a ton of work centered around a lot of areas of deliberation. So some of it has been conceptual things like how do we conceptualize and measure and then analyze deliberative reasoning and deliberative capacity. And some of it has been developing empirical approaches to this. And so we came together around some of his work on deliberation and gene editing. And those of you who know about the gene editing survey that we have spent the past 18 months or so working on here really came out of his group. He has been working with Francesco Veri for a while, and Francesco is now here at the University of Zurich as a senior researcher in the Center for Democracy Studies. So I'll let you say anything further that you wish to about your own background, but I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk with us about challenges.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. It's actually, I've been in Switzerland for the last 5 months, and it's going to be very hard to leave in a month's time.
Yeah,
but I will be back. It is a great, actually not only a great sort of environment, but it's been a great intellectual environment to be in as well. So it's been quite a joy. So looking forward to coming in and presenting here today. So thanks you for the introduction. I also wanted to introduce another member of our team. Now, Balazs, you're going to have to give me your last name because I always mess it up.
Go for it.
Okay.
The other part shouldn't be that hard.
I will learn. I'm terrible even with my own name, so it's not personal at all. It's just a thing I'm not very good at. So Balazs is actually is a sort of member of the team conceptually, but also doing our sort of software development, and that will be relevant with the talk because some of the methodologies we're developing are increasingly computationally intensive, which I won't have time to get into detail, but you'll see some of the results of some of that work. There's a lot more to do. So I've been told I've got an hour to talk, which is dangerous because I do have about 40 slides, but if it gets boring, if I see eyes glazing, I'll speed up. But on our side, it's not just dot points. There's a few dot points, but I'm very visual. And I spent most of yesterday putting together some new slides, animations, and so on. So yeah, this was just for you, but no pressure to be interested at all. I'll do better next time if it's not very interesting. But so today, I didn't want to just talk about the research we've been doing in Australia. I thought we could sort of wrap it up in a bit of conceptual work. And the thing that really sticks out in terms of working on genome editing, I've been sort of researching deliberative democracy for, I'm scared to tell you now, but 20 so years, 25, you can do my PhD. And I've been involved in designing / implementing over 20 delivery processes. And human genome editing just about killed me. Complexity is a really nice thing with human genome editing, and then it gets more complex, and we'll sort of cover that at the end because we just ran a process in Australia, but this is a global issue. So when you actually think about it on that scale, that's another order of magnitude. And I'll speak to the project that we had intended to implement, which I think we've all been given up on, but hopefully it may live again at the end of the talk, and hopefully it'll be sort of more. It'll be obvious why that is important to think about it in that dimension. So complexity is the theme applied to human genome editing, and the question is how do we actually approach this into the public engagement? And of course, I'm going to talk about this through the deliberative lens. I just need to get this out of my notes here. So it is about deliberation and complex issues, and through the lens of our project, which we call the Australian Citizens Jury on Human Genome Editing, which I will probably just call the AusCJ for short, because it's a bit of a mouthful to get through. So I'll do some sort of conceptual work, and I'll talk about how we theorize deliberation and what it does. And this is actually sort of a recent important development, which you're probably not familiar with, so I might take a little bit of time to get through that. We'll get to the application of this to the Australian Citizen's Jury, and I'll give you some background on the case study. And then once we've gone through that, we'll actually look at the effects of the process and see how well it handled the complexity of the issue and what the implications are of the findings that we've made so far. But I also wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into work that we're starting to develop, looking at experts and citizens when it comes to deliberation, not only in terms of their roles in the process of deliberation, but also addressing this sort of argument that you do get, and I'm sure this is something which you also subscribe to, is that this is up to experts to decide. And it's amazing how often you have to address this issue, but we actually have empirical evidence to demonstrate why citizens are good deliberative reasoners compared to experts. The evidence is very tentative. We've got a lot more work to do, but it's sort of fascinating to see. And I want to give you an insight into why deliberative reasoning is different to technical reasoning, if you like, and why it's important to think about these issues in that way. And then at the end, we'll go through some reflections on the implications, and I will actually talk about the Global Citizens Assembly project a little bit when we get to that point. And do feel free to put your hand up and ask questions if something's not clear, because a lot of this material is not only new to us here, it's actually new to the field as well. So it's very sort of, we've only just published this, the first version of this work, and I'm going to be showing you analyses which we haven't published yet as well. So it's all incredibly new and hopefully interesting. So the first one I want to sort of address is why deliberation in the first place. Why is deliberation and what we call deliberative democracy relevant to questions such as human genome editing? And I'm guessing that this isn't something I have to address at length with this group, but it's worth actually sort of touching the basis and what are the implications in terms of understanding the public. I'm going to look at this through the lens of what we call the public interest. What decisions actually reflect the interests of the public in this sense? And the assumption is that we need some input from the public, when the public interest is at stake, to help us make decisions about what to do. And so I'm going to actually contrast sort of a standard approach to these sorts of questions in terms of population surveys and what the status of what we get. What is the, because I want to say ontology, but that's probably overdoing it, of the empirical information that we get from population surveys. And I want to contrast that with deliberative outcomes. So when you run a population survey, you design, I mean, even the instrument design is different actually to what we do. And that's another conversation we won't get to in discussion if there's interest in the empirical design. But the assumption implicitly is that what we get it has some sort of legitimacy, if you like. I mean, we talk about legitimacy a lot in deliberative democracy, is that actually reflects a public view. But there's a question about what the status is, of course, and I'm sure you're all familiar with all, a lot of literature that's come out in recent years that assumes sort of human rationality, et cetera, et cetera. Now, one of the conclusions from that is that's drawn from this is that the public can't reason without actually looking at sort of what it is about that particular medium, if you like, that we're actually collecting that information. So I actually want to sort of just to contrast what we get from items that you might get in the population with not only sort of forming sort of the traditional idea of informed views about an issue or a question, but also want to introduce another dimension in terms of what is relevant to think about here, because the assumption is that these are sort of technical questions, but they're actually sort of ethical, normative ones as well, in the sense that our decisions should reflect what our values, aspirations, goals are, if you like, as a community. And when you look at this empirically and theoretically, it even gets more complex than that, because you find they start to interact a bit. As we learn about things, the way we express our values actually changes as well. So it's a very dynamic process. So and you'll see from the sort of model that I'll show you is that what you get at the outcome in terms of what we choose can be very different depending on how these bits of information or these components interact together. So we talk about values. Often when people talk about measuring values, for example, they do it in a very unproblematic way. But that's the end of the story. But when you get to the end of a decision, all sorts of things can happen along the way. And hopefully we'll get you an insight into that. And of course, one important dimension is the time frame that we think of as well. In terms of these processes, there's difference, I think, a year versus sort of generations down the track. And something like genome editing, especially if it's heritable, of course, the genie's out of the bottle in that sense, and it's worth really thinking seriously about what the implications are. So, contrasting this with deliberation. So, deliberative democracy is very hard to easily define because there's a lot of diversity even within the field, and I confess that I'm probably not mainstream in some respects in terms of deliberative democracy, because it's a very procedurally based theory, which is actually difficult for me because I actually came into it as an economist originally. I was actually really interested in what does a choice of preference mean, and I decided very early on that economics wasn't going to cut it. But what my work has been doing is actually trying to understand what this means substantively. How do the ideals of deliberation translate into something we might call a deliberative outcome, if you like, sort of give you a bit of a window into that. And the sort of concept that might be relevant here is something that John Dryzek and I have been working on, hopefully that we publish soon, is the idea of expressive epistemic justice. Now, we don't have to dwell on this too much, is that, it does the choice that we actually sort of, we measure or we gauge from the public actually really reflect their interests. Have they actually expressed to us what they might want if all the relevant values, beliefs, and so on actually came into play? And often that's not the case, not just for reasons of life's complex and so on, and you get all sorts of effects where we think more narrowly. In politics, of course, we have issues like manipulatory, populism, etc., which emotionally steers us into thinking about ways that are very narrow, and that can really distort what we get. I hope I'm not getting too carried away on the theory side of things, but it'll get more interesting. There's two big questions in deliberative democracy. First of all, what is deliberation? What does it do? Is it measurable? And hopefully we've addressed that to some extent. But the big one is the achievability. And I want to sort of, it's a very highfalutin ideal in a sense, and it's been criticized as being a bit out there in terms of the goals. And I want to speak to that a little bit as well. So deliberative democracy and deliberative reason. Deliberative democracy, can be summarized very, very easily. It's actually sort of a whole scheme of scholarship that informs the design of processes, institutions, democratic institutions, and so on, that help to facilitate collectively to decide what to do in light of reasons. Simple as that. But there's all sorts of ideas that come into play. Theoretically and empirically, when we talk about reasons, we look at it through the lens of what we might call considerations. What to be considered? What are the values and beliefs that are relevant here? The interest of the future generations is just one. For example, there's all sorts of technical considerations, of course. And actually, one thing we found in that way around the process is that equality, is a big consideration in relation to this. One of the problems is that you don't necessarily know what is relevant until you start talking about it. And that's actually one of the goals of deliberation, is to sort of widen that view and understand what is relevant when we actually decide what to do. When we think about deciding what to do, the way we measure this is in terms of express preferences. So we use sort of ranked policy options, and human genome editing is very hard to develop an instrument for. It was very, very tricky. And connecting these two in terms of what we consider and what we choose is reasoning itself. And conceptually, we use the term representation because it's not like a syllogistic reasoning. It's actually kind of a collective understanding broadly of how the world works around the issue. And there's a lot of interesting work going on in terms of how we reason as humans, which turns out not to be rational syllogistic in the first place, right? And so this sort of captures that idea. And the whole point about this model is not that it actually imposes from the top down ideas of rationality, instrumentality, and so on. What actually constitutes a consideration representation is something we observe, we don't impose. It comes out of the relationships between those within the group. So we actually look at this at the group level. So if we actually collectively understand what the world looks like and what's relevant, and we agree and we factor that into our reasoning, we get some interesting regularities that we can observe. And that's something to be really clear about, because there's often a misrepresentation on what we do, in terms of it being about rationality in the traditional sense. It's really not, and hopefully that's clear as we go along. Another important sort of factor to think about is that there's two different dimensions operating here. I mentioned this before. One is the classic deep thinking, technical correctness, understanding what is broadly correct, and not even necessarily understanding what is broadly correct, even just agreeing that it's relevant, whether we agree or not, whether something's correct is actually part of the scheme here. But the part that's often missing when we think about these sorts of issues is the breadth of thinking, if you like, in terms of what we take into account. And this is where the ethical dimension comes into play. Think about future generations, indigenous people and so on, and all those sorts of things. There's a whole spectrum of things that are potentially relevant. We collectively decide what is important here. Okay, how are we going, everyone with me so far? All good? Okay, great. So now we're going to be starting towards the empirical part. So when we think about the ideas of deliberation, there's lots going on here, but we just summarize them under the idea of reciprocity, which is basically that we're listening and we take seriously what others are saying, and we don't necessarily have to believe or actually sort of form the same conclusions. It's just that we can decide whether that is relevant and important, and actually listen to the logic and take that into account, or decide whether to take that into account ourselves. So that's broadly, I mean, it also captures all sorts of other things that we talk about in democracy, like empathy, listening, and so on. The other part is reflexivity, is that because we're taking this seriously, we're adjusting our positions in light of what we learn, which is what we do as good scholars, right? It's sort of like a street epistemology version of that. So we listen, we work out, we might learn what's relevant, we might even learn a bit about how the world works or the issue. And this actually, the combination of these forms something that John Roskin and I have called meta-consensus. We don't necessarily agree on what values are important. We don't necessarily even agree on beliefs, but we agree on what's relevant, and we agree on the model of the world, if you like. An analogy of that is that we sort of have this model of how genes work. For example, that we may just because we understand that, we don't necessarily agree that genome editing is something that we actually do. We might just disagree on what form and the application and so on. So complexity as a concept is notoriously difficult to define. I'm sure you've all come across this issue, but we're applying a sort of a deliberative democratic lens on this. So we think about the complexity in these terms, in terms of the breadth of what's important. What are the range of sort of considerations that come into play, and what's relevant, and how these considerations weigh on what should be done, and what are the sort of complexity in terms of working that through cognitively. So the model actually involves a number of ways that we can change our mind, and I alluded to this earlier on. So the field itself, and this has been a real weakness, I think, is actually focused on the idea of opinion change as being sort of driving anything. If we deliberate, we change our opinions. I'm going to publish a paper soon on this. We've got lots of evidence to show that no, because you can change your opinions for all sorts of reasons that aren't necessarily deliberative. The whole litany of scholarship that demonstrates why that's not the case. And the more we actually look at this, the clearer it is a poor measure by itself. And that's because there's more than just opinion transformation going on when we're actually learning about issues and deliberating. We've got to look at the terminology here, but the other mechanism is we understand the model can change, if you like, the way we understand how the world works. So we may have the same opinions and beliefs and values and so on, but if we update our understanding of the world, we actually may change the conclusions that we favour at the end of that. But the most relevant one here is what we call integrative transformation. And this seems to be the biggest effect of deliberation, is to broaden the scope of what we take into account our reasoning. And Balazs and Francesco and I are just getting onto this work now. This is sort of the new extension. This seems to be a very intriguing sort of element of what happens in deliberation. And the way to think about the ideal that we're going to be talking about is almost the inverse of what you might call motivated reasoning, where you justify an outcome that you already prefer by selecting the evidence that supports it. Whereas deliberation is the opposite of that, is actually looking at the big picture that you might, in principle, agree as a group is relevant to the issue. And that has very strong transformative effects. Very quickly, I'm nearly at the end of the empirical and theoretical bit. We're going to get to the case study in just a moment. So the net effect of all these mechanisms in the ideal that if we understand what's important and relevant, and we feel like that's salient when we're actually sort of thinking about the issue and deciding, or at least it factors in what we choose, we have better consensus on that level. We share an understanding of how the world works. And if we're not engaged in motivated reasoning, like we're not conveniently choosing the argument that suits the ends that the outcomes that we prefer beforehand, then we actually can observe some consistency in the results. Then there's some regularities that emerge in between how we rate considerations, and we use these with propositions. It's a lot of work to develop the survey, where we actually have a proposition that may speak to a value or belief in relation to the issue. So we have a situation that if we agree, to the extent that we agree on the range of relevant considerations, is actually reflected in the extent to which we agree on the outcome. So if Francesco and I agree on everything in terms of all the values and beliefs, we also then would tend to agree in terms of the choices that we make. But if we completely disagree, then the inverse is the case. And this is what we measure. This is the beginning of the story in terms of deliberative reason, what we call the deliberative reason index. So if we correlate Francesco and my survey responses to the considerations, we correlate them, and then we have a correlation of our policy preferences. We can then plot this in terms of the distance from a unity line, if you like, and it's the distance from that line which reflects the extent or the lack of extent of consistency, which we then aggregate to produce an index called the deliberative reason index. So this is actually a plot from my very first case study, my PhD case study, which is your first love, if you like. It's always my favorite, and it's actually the most dramatic transformation that I've seen so far. But almost all the cases we've explored, not entirely. You can jump in whenever I say something that you don't agree with here. Reflects this basic pattern. So when we plot, this is pairs of individuals, right? So this is lots of Francescos and we plotted. We find that before deliberation, there's more agreement on terms of the considerations, which isn't reflected on the preferences. And that's often because of things like salience effects and narrow thinking, motivated reasoning, and so on. This was a very politicized issue, if you like. It was there was a lot of sort of populist arguments and so on before in the public sphere beforehand. And the transformation, this is animation, right? So got to pay attention to this bit, only because it took a lot of work to do. This is what we see. Those sorts of transformations, where our values and beliefs as a group are consistent with our expression in terms of what we choose afterwards. The content of that isn't important for the purpose of this. And in a way, it really reflects a situation where you can deliberate and understand the world together, even though the outcome actually may still have some holes in it, bits of information missing and so on. It reflects a state, if you like, rather than sort of an idea, just an idea outcome. So we've actually used this analysis and we've applied it to about 20 or so case studies. It's the only, to our knowledge, it's the only study like this that's been done in the field, where there's been a systematic attempt to actually understand what's going on across multiple case studies. And one of the problems with the field, like I mentioned before, is that there hasn't been a dependent variable of this to use, and so this is the application. And so very nervously, we put this all together and we did the analysis and we got results. And lo and behold, issue complexity was an important dimension that by itself actually suppressed deliberative reasoning. I mean, it was harder to achieve higher levels of reasoning with complex issues. It's a more complex story than that. Actually, what we found is that it interacts with other things that mitigate that effect, but the headline is that complexity is important. It counts. So in terms of complexity, the way we operationalized it is that we looked at the breadth of the question. How much had to be considered? Now, was it a big picture question or was it sort of very narrow and with less elements to think of? That with the remit scope, the geographic scale, there was local or global and in between, and the amount of information and also the technical nature of the information. We have sort of scorers that rated that. And so across these are the studies, and some studies have more than one case involved in them. We then, we scored, and then we aggregated, and lo and behold, the Australian Citizens Jury came out pretty much on top in terms of complexity. it is a pretty complex issue, and it was very hard to design a process for. So, without further ado, straight to the case study itself. Has anyone actually seen anything about the study that we did in Australia and the report that we produced? Well, there's a report on. We produced an enormous report. Thank Diane. Yes, but it's a nice sort of recipe book for anyone who actually wants to design a process. Here, it covers a lot of elements, and Diane Nicol, of course, is incredibly thorough, impressively thorough, in everything she approaches. This is the sequence of events associated with the project. We had a sort of a pre-stage, which I'll speak to. We had the event itself. Then we had sort of a post set of events, which I won't speak to so much. The one that's relevant here is the population survey, which I will speak to, which actually helps sort of confirm some of our results, or test some of our results, if you like. So when we talk about the first stage, I'd love to tell you the whole history about how this all happened in the first place, but that's another day. It was basically a documentary filmmaker who talked us into a global citizens assembly on genome editing, and my life has never been the same since. But that's again another story for another day. So beforehand, this is Diane's part of the research. The part she was responsible for. The thing about this is that none of these are complex. Compared to a lot of issues we've worked with, there's not a lot of public conversation going on. And so when you design this process, you usually you need to get an understanding of what's relevant and what we need to sort of cover. And the only way we could do this was really effectively, was for Diane to go and interview lots of experts, lots of people involved in the issue. We gathered a heck of a lot of information, which also helped us sort of shape the survey instruments that we developed. And then after that, we actually collated this into the research instrument, and that was the hardest. We collected 1,200 statements that we categorized and then selected among and then tested 3 times to actually develop the survey. It took months of work. Sometimes it takes a week to do this. This took months. It was huge. So we gathered all these statements that reflected considerations, and then we did an analysis of using a sort of a small sample. It's basically kind of an analogy of an ecological survey, if you like, because what are the species that are out there? What are the sort of types of positions that we can observe? And we've got 4 main ones. What we actually found was that most of the respondents were gangbusters. Everyone thought that the technology was really cool, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, so that was the sort of scientific process. That was the main response that we got. Then we got some concern, but the concerns sort of were around the edges, and sometimes they were more necessarily related to the issue itself, like science and technology is controlling our lives. So it's almost like a sort of second order concern, if you like. There were some cultural belief issues. In fact, the cultural beliefs really should be more in C. That's in the wrong place there. Which actually brings me to C. There was a small group that was expressed more profound concerns, things like religious, ethical, existential concerns related to the issue. Now, this is where the population survey is relevant. So we then we benchmarked these results against the Australian population in the survey. I can't remember the exact percentages, but scientific progress was by far the biggest discourse in the Australian community, followed by bit of principal concern. And agnostic and profound concern were in the order of 1%-ish, I think, like really, really small. But still important. And this is where I want to get to the sort of next stage of what we have to do here. So usually when you design one of these processes, you say you have a representative sample because you've got gender, age, education that reflects the community, but you might be missing important arguments there. And this is where John Drysick and I came up with the idea. So we did this quickly. We did stratification, but we also engaged in what John and I call discursive representation. And the thing that's exciting about this is that we published this paper, my goodness, it was 16 years ago. 8 years ago. Help me out here. It should have died 13 years ago. That's it. Sorry, I'm a bit sleep deprived, so I'm not. Francesco is the math guy of the team. You can probably tell. I don't know. We published this a long time ago, and this was the first time we'd actually done this systematically. We actually did what we said. I can't believe it took us this long. So what we proposed in this paper, and this is actually, I think this is my most cited paper, and we still haven't, and people said, why haven't you done this? So we did do it. So we then set up quotas for each of these discourses to try and get even amounts of participants. And this is what we got, something like this map. We didn't quite achieve the quotas in every sense, but at least we've got some representation, less so agnosticism, but in the profound concern, we got some folks. And Francesco did some mathematics again. Thank you, Francesco, which worked out that the chances if we've done regular, we performed regular demographic stratification would have been about in the order of 5% to get one person representing this discourse. So the complexity of the arguments may not have actually been in the room, but there's two ways you can do this. You can have those considerations reflected amongst the participants, and ideally you do. The other dimension of this is that there's the information, the presenters that you get to speak to all these relevant perspectives. And we had a lot of discussion around this. And my experience has been that it's not just technical. You need to have people that speak to community concerns. So I often sort of distinguish technical and community witnesses, if you like. They can be people from, I'm thinking pressure groups, that's not the right term. So my lack of sleep, I've had 3 nights without much sleep, interest groups and so on, to actually speak to issues. And these are really important to field these arguments as part of these processes. And these are our participants. The thing that was really great about this is that we didn't stratify for ethnicity. We did actually filter out people who studied genetics and were doing a PhD in it and so on, had professional interests. And it's amazing how often you do get lots of self-selection in that respect. But the diversity was really impressive. The sort of top of the stairs tends to be the researchers, and the bottom. It was really an amazing group. We had all walks of life, from people who were sort of very well educated, well to do and so on. And one chap actually lived on a boat. They lived in a sort of almost like a dinghy in a harbour somewhere in Western Australia, and it was like lovely guy. But yeah, usually wouldn't actually have a chance to express himself on an issue like this. And everyone, and what you always find with these processes is that people really enjoy them. Funnily enough, and even for an issue as hard as this, which almost killed us, everyone really enjoyed the processes, and people often, and there's a really good reason for this, which we can actually speak. I think there's a really good reason for this, we can speak to in a discussion as well. So the process itself now. Now, we did the standard thing on day one. We had a sort of icebreaker event where everyone gets to know each other, and this is really important actually to establish trust and get familiar as a group, and get help them to bond a little bit. There's some information about the process, which is obviously really important to know what to expect. We also had a reception where we had people from the decision-making organisations come along and to mingle with the participants, which was really important to give them a sense that it was relevant, important what they were doing, and the buy-in was actually really impressive in relation to this process. That was in the evening on day one, and then on day two, in the morning, the first thing we do, and this is something I think is really important as a standard now, this is the group building, or the core group building. So it's not just introducing the group, and the standard approach in amongst practitioners is to stand up and say, this is what deliberation looks like, that's how you're going to behave. And then just by accident, many years ago, I worked with a facilitator, which has been my go-to ever since, where instead of doing this, what she does is she gets the group together, has at least a 20-minute to an hour session with them, and say, okay, this is your process. How do you think we should engage with each other? And people put their hands up and say we should respect each other. And what you get is sort of a desert errata that actually reflects what deliberate theorists have been talking about for 20 years. And the thing that's really exciting about this demonstrates how intuitive these norms of behavior are, and yet how uncommon they are in sort of politics writ large. We've even done this with school kids, and same sort of results. This is what we get in terms of the sort of ideals. So we have a piece of butcher's paper where they call it butcher's paper over here. where they generate their own norms, and we get a list like this, and it stays up on the wall. Often they don't have to refer to it, but if someone actually starts to try and dominate the group, someone sort of pulls up and sort of points to the piece of paper on the wall, and they self-regulate, which means that the facilitator doesn't have to work so hard as well to keep reinforcing these. And it's amazing how much buy-in you get when you do this every time. So this is actually reflected in the results when we did the analysis. So complexity was actually the strongest sort of suppressor of or barrier, if you like, to reasoning. The strongest. The biggest factor in improving group reasoning was actually group building. We actually coded this in terms of different levels, from just introducing to, I don't remember the all four levels. Like one was sort of basically bring them to the room, go, introductions, instructing them what to do, group building, and then the top level was actually a process we ran in Sweden where we had group building plus mindfulness training, and that actually had the strongest effect of them all. Reasons we haven't actually had a chance to write up yet. That's fascinating. Okay, so then this is more standard, the information phase. But the thing that is interesting here, I think I alluded to, was that the information it was sort of technical, and there was a bit of philosophical coverage, but it was from an academic perspective in terms of the sort of ethical dimensions and so on. And the witnesses were fantastic. Oh, actually, I have a picture here. Where did my picture go? Sorry. Oh, okay. Moving on. There was, it didn't actually have these sort of community perspectives. And that's partly because they were hard to get, because there wasn't a very well formed sort of community. Even though there kind of is, but it was, it's a long story, but it turned out to be a real weakness for the process, and I'll get to that way. And then we got to deliberation proper, where we start sort of working through the issues as a group with a view to developing a report. And this is an important component of the design here as well. These are different variations in terms of what you can do, from the citizens jury model, where there's a development of a report where we can have different groups that minority report, majority, but they work through the issue and they reason through the issue and they develop their own recommendations. You don't sort of preset what to come up with. And I actually think this is the best model, but it's hard to do. And there are reasons for doing it differently as well, under different circumstances, but it certainly produces the highest reasoning results. And Francesco and I are producing another paper, which is under R&R, which actually looks at this empirically. The worst thing you can do is say, generate proposals, advocate for them, and then vote for them at the end of the process. The thing that really sort of triggered this was a process in Italy that we ran 10 or so years ago, where the facilitator went rogue and said, okay, we're going to stand up and have a vote and see where everyone is. And I couldn't understand a word of Italian. I meant to learn some while I was here. I think I did a very good job. But you could see in the body language that people were shutting down. It was really obvious. And that was reflected in the results as well. They switched from actually thinking about this issue as a group broadly to defending the turf in terms of their position and then reverting to these ideas of methodologies and so on. And I've been involved in a process in Sweden on climate change where they designed just this, and I've just got the data, and lo and behold, reasoning goes down. This one, not for everyone, but it seems to be that the folks who were advocating for the outcomes, which is fascinating, sort of more evidence for this sort of dynamic. And then we had a closing ceremony where I do have a picture this time, but I can see it coming. Whew, that's a relief. Where the participants actually had spokespeople presenting their recommendations to decision makers. And it was a wonderful ceremony. It was a wonderful closing. It was sort of a event for the whole process. And then we produced the report, and then we handed it on, and we still got to do a lot of research to actually find out what's happened to it since. So that was the process. Okay. I'm gonna sort of try and wrap this up in 5 minutes or so. So just bear with me. Just really quickly now, these are the results in terms of transformation. So let's look at the opinion transformation. I've just done a selection of items here. These are some of the statements that if you can read them, that were part of the consideration survey. And generally, you don't get much change. but you do as well, and I think this is sort of important to note, is that opinion change can move in different directions, but also you can have a situation where there's sort of thematic changes amongst individuals that do amount to something, some of the parts. And this is where sort of using these sort of discourses as a lens to look at the transformations can be really useful. So this is a sort of a new map, if you like. We had the 4, sort of bubble map, and we went to a 6th one because the outcomes were a bit more nuanced at the end of the process, which it's a nightmare to try and represent on a 2-dimensional space, but we did our best. And these are the sorts of movements that we observed. So we generally we're sort of going from the bottom left to the upper right. And again, there was sort of like more in the direction of beneficial scientific process, but when you look at the discourse itself, it's more contingent. And one of the big themes was the questions of equality and access. This was not about sort of something for wealthy people to access. It was by far the biggest conclusion out of the process. You really saw the potential. But it was actually cautious. I mean, the fact that the sort of the terms don't really reflect this so much. It was about doing this in a very ordered and staged ways, and not just sort of the Wild West, if you like. And this was particularly the case with heritable genome editing. That there was interest in doing research on that, but there was also a gap. And this is why we had to have a backup process. Is that there wasn't a discussion on the application for using again my legacy is coming in, embryos. And we realized that the recommendations didn't reflect that. There was a missing consideration in the discussion. And so we tried to sort of, after the fact, have a conversation about this online, which participants, most of them actually participated after the event to work through this issue. So we actually have an amendment and work through that. But it is fair to say that the results don't necessarily reflect fully that discussion. So there's a gap there in that dimension as well. But there's still some principal concern, a profound concern, even at the bottom of the figure there. That's really important. And this is something that came up after the event. So we did a lot of evaluation work afterwards. Almost universally, everyone was very happy. But the one major criticism we had was that people said, there was something that came up in discussion in the group that there were these really profound concerns that we didn't have a chance to work through. And that seems to be gap. So it became a source of criticism. But the irony is that discussion came from those individuals, from that discourse, that we wouldn't have had in the process in the first place to come up. So it's really interesting that came up as a criticism. It and taken in. It was taken. We took it well. I mean, of course, it was genuinely a gap in the process. So there was a limitation in our results in that sense. So this is the analysis, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to animate this yesterday. So it's just a static version of the analysis. So the index was 0.34 before deliberation, which is about the average query, or a bit lower than the average query. Yeah. The pre-deliberation index of 0.34. I think it's a little bit lower than average, but anyway, it's a complex issue, right? So that's not surprising, but we did get a pretty good transformation. Yeah, I think it's lower than that. We'll have to have a look. From 0.34 to 0.47. There's a little bit of variation within the groups.
I mean, it's kind of an average, but yes. Okay.
The transformation is average, but I think it's a bit lower.
Yeah.
This is actually, there's a methodological consideration here that because the survey has to be bespoke, it has to reflect what's relevant. We can't just sort of, impose, what we think is relevant and use the same survey for every study. It can be hard to compare. Right? We don't know exactly what to say this is, and this is some work we have to do to sort of validate. But Francesco very cleverly worked out ways that we can do comparative work, at least with the data we have so far.
I mean, the effect size of the transformation is a bit lower. I mean,
and that's the complexity, that we So one thing we did find is that the transformation is lower, but there's an interaction between complexity and group building. So if you have group building, the effect is the transformation is much higher. For example, and it comes through in a number of ways, the influence of group building. So the analysis that we're starting to work on now is what we're calling integration. And the easy way of describing this is it's just a measure of how individual items are factoring in the group's reasoning. Okay, so it's a sort of a 0 to 1. This is before deliberation. This is a sample again of different statements. So it's not very low, but it's reasonably low. There's nothing that sort of stands out, if you like. So we look at two things. We look at the amount of integration for statements, and we look at sort of the distribution of that. Is there sort of a focus on a small set of items amongst the group, or is it sort of is it broad? And it turns out that it's reasonably broad, but it's low for the group. And then afterwards, we get a dramatic change in integration for the statements. And that also is reasonably broad as well, actually. And you'll see this again when we look at experts. One thing I want to point out is that one thing that didn't change was interfering in people's genes is intervening in people's genes is intervening a bit too far in human creation. It's one of those sort of profound concerns that were part of that discourse, which they didn't have enough time to discuss, which, and again, I couldn't publish this, but it's interesting that we don't get an improvement in the integration of that dimension into the process. So we'll get to the sort of headline just at the conclusions quickly, but quickly, citizens and experts. Two questions. Do the participants just simply follow the cues of the experts? And what's the sort of relative reasoning those between the two? Firstly, they don't follow the experts. There's actually a difference in the reasoning. And the second conclusion is they're about the same before deliberation for this sample. They actually improve a bit more after deliberation. And when we look at the integration analysis, again, their averages are a bit different. Well, they're pretty similar here, but their transformations don't sort of reflect a movement towards those positions. But you can actually see the participants on the last two columns. The level of integration is a bit higher than the experts. The difference is the experts actually from memory are broader in their integration. But the story here is this isn't quite dramatic. It is often the case when we look at sort of experts or stakeholders, part of interest groups, is they're very good at reasoning, but very narrowly. The extreme version of this is some work that Francesco and I are doing on artificial intelligence and Elijah on artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is an extraordinarily good reason on a narrow range of considerations. It's actually the worst results we get when you look at all the considerations on this study compared to the participants. And there's a lot more work to be done on drawing that out. So what I'm doing, and what I'm saying is there's a difference between good reasoning and integrative reasoning. And integrative reasoning in this case is ethical reasoning, if you like. And that's it. So just quickly some reflections. Okay, how will it handle complexity? Well, in some senses well, but there were some gaps, right? In terms of the profound ethical considerations, some technical issues, questions around the use of human embryos, which has an important ethical dimension as well, of course. Question is how this can be improved. I think just basically actually having sort of some more community witnesses would have been a big part of that process. One way you can improve this is actually doing more work with the group in the lead up to actually designing a process. There was a model called the consensus conference that developed in Denmark, which is actually the best model in this sense, where they actually spend months working with participants before they even get the witnesses into the room, and they get to sort of work out what is relevant for them. And I think for an issue like this, where there isn't much public discussion, that's probably a good model to think about. I've talked about the importance of discursive diversity, but the one thing I do want to talk about quickly is the big picture here. So how can this be scaled up, both in terms of looking at the big picture and in public design? And this was the idea of the Global Citizens Assembly, where we wanted to bring a global community together to discuss this issue. And one thing that I was really keen to be able to investigate here is what are the differences in terms of the cultural dimension here, for example? Do we have a situation where someone from one particular cultural background may produce a high shared understanding, which isn't shared with the rest of the group? Does that actually occur? And if it does, do we get synthesis and integration across those differences? And then those considerations part of the process, which are very hard to get. We need about $5 million Australian dollars to do this. We got within a whisker twice, and didn't quite get there for all sorts of reasons, which is another story. We'll see, maybe. Then the other question, though, is that how do we get the public involved in this conversation? And this is where the documentary would be fantastic, to actually communicate not only the results and the outcome, but also the emotionality of the process and the fact that we could work together and understand and so on, despite our different backgrounds, and actually look at the effect on that. And we know that these things can make a difference, not in documentary sense, but Francesco has done some work in Switzerland here, looking at the impact of just sending a letter or brochure.
Basically, one-page report is related to the referendum. So we sent to the citizen, so the deliberative process look into the referendum topic, and then the report say, well, what's the referendum is about, and what's the relevant statement for supporting or opposing the referendum. Yeah, and the citizen receive this together with the official booklet, the consideration. But we observed a few things. One of the things, there is an increase of knowledge on referendum, better than the booklets. So that's it's kind of very, very evident. And the other as well, we have an impact on reasoning. Well, we don't have I would say measure this in a conservative way, but we can tell there is an impact on this.
So it's a tantalizing possibility that we've got more work to do. We're about to sort of launch into fieldwork in Australia where we're using the video material that the documentary filmmakers sort of commissioned, even though she's not doing the documentary itself anymore, to put together a package to show participants not just the sort of technical process, but also how people felt about it, how they went through the process, and just see what sort of impact that has, and see if it simulates or emulates the sort of effects that we saw in the process itself. So that's there's a lot more work to do in this space, but it's a complex space. There's a lot going on here. But the last point I want to make is that it's not just information. It's just what I'm calling at the moment is dispositional effects. It's how we're oriented towards the information or the issue. And then that captures things like how much we trust each other, whether we're actually inclined to engage in motivated forms of reasoning versus being open and so on. This is a really important avenue for research in this space. And that was it. So thank you all for staying with me. Yes.